Raphael forms the trinity of great masters of the Italian High Renaissance, alongside Leonardo and Michelangelo. All three of these artists were working in Rome at the same time.
What an exciting lot, really. They were multi-skilled, highly intelligent. Raphael was very, very admiring of Leonardo.
He did work in all these different media and styles, and he was good at all of them. You know, no wonder Michelangelo hated him.
While Michelangelo and Leonardo reached old age, Raphael would die suddenly at just 37. But in that time, he still produced a staggering array of works.
Raphael was highly prolific. This was helped by the fact that he had a large studio. It's said that he employed up to 50 assistants in his workshop.
It was actually the largest workshop team that we know of for any Renaissance artist, so it was really quite unprecedented in its scale.
He was producing enormous amounts of drawings and paintings and commissions. Astonishing, actually, to have produced that amount of work during so little time.
Many of Raphael's paintings have been on truly remarkable journeys ever since his passing. One is even rumoured to have survived a shipwreck on its way to Sicily.
Apparently all of the cargo was lost, and the Raphael painting was washed up in Genoa in its case.
The painting was in a box all nailed up and locked up, and it was open to reveal this kind of unbelievable masterpiece.
It apparently had been saved by the gods because Raphael was such a perfect artist.
There are all these sort of biblical parallels in the story that are trying to depict Raphael as a Christ figure in Renaissance painting.
But despite his enormous fame and enduring reputation, some of Raphael's works, including the Madonna of the Pinks, lost their attribution to the master as the centuries went by. And ever since, it's been a battle to reclaim his remarkable canon. Raphael was born Raffaello Sanzio da Urbino in the year 1483, but we know little about his early life. However, an early self-portrait that could very well be the young Raphael demonstrates the talents of a tremendously gifted young artist.
His father was court painter to Federico de Montefeltro and the Duke of Urbino, so he obviously came from an artistic background.
We know that he was a very well-spoken man, according to Vasari, that he was educated, and that's because he grew up in this court setting. And after his father's death, it has been suggested that he carried on looking after the workshop and studio. So he had a very early introduction into the world of painting and patronage.
At some point in the late 15th century, Raphael left his hometown of Urbino and made his way to Umbria, where he was able to learn from Pietro Perugino.
Perugino was another Renaissance painter from the Umbrian school. There's some debate as to at what age Raphael got sent into his patronage, but we do know that he had worked and he spent a few years in the workshop of Perugino.
Perugino painted serene figures with beautiful landscapes in the background of his altarpieces, and this initially had quite an influence on Raphael's style.
Perugino was famous for painting pictures that were sweet. Raphael turned it into something else. He turned it into something sort of refined and fine.
We know that they both worked in this very similar technique of applying the paint quite heavily, and we definitely know that Raphael found this a very formative time in his career.
Later in life, people could hardly distinguish Raphael's work from Perugino's work, which means that he was very adept at imitating his master and also very talented.
Raphael completed his training around the age of 17, and his first known commission was the Baronci altarpiece, which was sadly damaged in an earthquake in the 18th century. Only a few fragments remain. He worked on several other altarpieces soon after for various churches, as he lived the life of a nomadic artist. Inevitably, he would soon spend time in the blossoming city of Florence, where he came into contact with the other two legendary figures of the era.
There were three great masters of the Italian Renaissance. There was first of all Leonardo, then Michelangelo, and then Raphael. Raphael was the younger of the trio. Leonardo was 30 years older, and Michelangelo was 8 years older. These two artists had a great influence on his own work.
They're the three greats of the High Renaissance, and what an exciting lot, really, is the first thing to say, and all very different. Raphael was very admiring of Leonardo.
We can instantly see that he's gleaning inspiration, technique, really looking at what was new, what was special about Da Vinci and taking it into his own work, but without losing his own sort of sense of colour and drama, which were really intrinsic to Raphael.
Leonardo's influence on Raphael was primarily about the movement and the position of bodies in the paintings. And when it comes to the Mona Lisa, the pose was one which Raphael also adopted in some of his own paintings.
In terms of the work of Michelangelo, there's a real sense of him sort of looking at that monumental sculptural aspect of the figures that you see with Michelangelo. And somehow, I think Raphael sort of softens those and makes a more classical, if you like, way of revealing the body.
There was no greater honor than to have the patronage of the Pope, and Raphael was in luck with the election of Julius II. The new pontiff was impressed with the talents of the young artist, and Raphael would be assigned to work at the Vatican at the same time as Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel.
Pope Julius had a major influence on Raphael because in 1508 he invited Raphael to Rome, which was a major centre of the art world, and that's really where Raphael made his career.
He had all these commissions to give out, and one of them was for his library, the so-called stanze, and those went to Raphael, who was relatively young and relatively little known.
The Stanza della Sognatura is now seen as one of his greatest masterpieces. It's got the School of Athens, it's got the Parnassus and the Disputar, now incredibly famous works. So he was straight away working in the Vatican, taking on these kind of ultimate commissions alongside Michelangelo's work in the Vatican.
Michelangelo, of course, was a bitter old pig, so he seems to have hated Raphael from before he met him. And was always going on about Raphael sort of stealing his work and stealing his ideas.
Michelangelo loathed him, saw him as a copycat artist, said everything he knows he learnt from me. So there was an instant dislike on the part of Michelangelo for the younger artist. I think he saw him as a threat.
For all that, I must say Raphael included a portrait of Michelangelo in the School of Athens stanza, so, seems to be rather nicer than Michelangelo was.
One of Raphael's greatest paintings is the portrait of Pope Julius II, the man who was so taken with his work. The portrait inspired many copies, and for centuries it was thought that the Uffizi in Florence housed the original by Raphael. But recent scientific tests indicated otherwise.
The portrait of Julius II is actually quite an unusual portrait for the time. Popes tend to be rendered front on or completely in profile. And also it really captures a moment. He's really thinking. You can see that he's sort of lost in thought.
It was said to frighten people at the time. There was a kind of living humanism in it that bothered people in the Renaissance, because up until then, painters had tended to deal in ideals. And suddenly here was this man who looks a bit sort of sad and beaten up, actually. He doesn't look like a triumphant pope.
There's several versions of Raphael's portrait of Pope Julius. It's a wonderful portrait showing the very pensive Pope. A lot of research has been done, and the National Gallery have established that their version, dating from about 1511, is the original.
We know that the original hangings in the background behind Pope Julius were blue and gold textiles, and there were symbols within that of the cross keys, the papal keys. He then painted over this with the current background, so this was masked, but we can see beneath it lie all these papal clues.
It was cleaned or x-rayed, I think, in 1970, and they found an invoice mark on it that showed it had been in a collection that clearly meant it was the original.
With X-ray, we found a small number in the corner of this work, which directly corresponds with the references and records of the Borghese paintings. So this really validated it as the true original.
Pope Julius II would die in 1513 to be succeeded by Pope Leo X. Raphael would be commissioned for his portrait as well. He was incredibly busy working on different projects at the Vatican and had an enormous workshop to help satisfy the demands of being such a successful artist. But at the height of his powers, it would all come to a tragic end.
Raphael died suddenly in 1520 at the age of 37, and Vasari, the important early Italian art historian, said that it was the result of a night of passion with his mistress.
He became increasingly ill over about 15 days, and it was really a sort of slow decline over those days, and he had the last rites, and then he had this incredibly grand funeral.
It all comes from Vasari. I desperately want to believe it. That said, the way that history was written in the Renaissance was very kind of different from now. You tried to write in a way that mimicked authoritative sources. The most authoritative source was the Bible. If Vasari is telling the truth, then Raphael died on Good Friday, which is, of course, the day that our Lord ascended into heaven. There's a definite tendency to depict Raphael as a kind of Christ figure in Vasari's historiography.
Raphael's remarkable talents, especially in portraiture, would have a lasting impact on the artists that followed him. After his sudden death, his paintings would scatter across the globe as people clamoured for works by one of the greats of the High Renaissance. And in that process, incredible events would unfold. Raphael died on the 6th of April 1520. He was buried in one of Rome's most famous landmarks, the Pantheon. On his tomb was inscribed, "Here lies that famous Raphael, by whom nature feared to be conquered while he lived, and when he was dying, feared herself to die." From that point on, many of Raphael's most important works, including his portrait of his friend Baldassare Castiglione, would inspire future generations. And others would begin their incredibly eventful journeys to their homes today.
The portrait of Baldassare Castiglione was very modern at the time. It's very simple, it's very naturalistic, it's very pared back, it's almost monochromatic. And we know that he's wearing a winter dress, so it was painted around 1514. And we also know as a character, he probably would have wanted this kind of rendition of something that was very pared back, simple. This is what's made it a completely timeless portrait and why so many other artists over the years have copied the pose.
It's had an astonishing influence, this painting. Titian saw it and did his own version based on it. Rembrandt saw it when it was auctioned in Amsterdam, and he did several self-portraits which were in a similar pose. And other artists have done copies of it, and they include such varied characters as Rubens and Matisse, so it's had an enormous influence.
It seems to crystallize something, and I'm sure, actually, that portraits of people that are not straight commissions, these are the portraits that actually really have a real intensity about them because the artist knows the sitter. And so that, I think, can be transferred through the business of painting.
Other works to have an immediate and profound impact on the art world were the Raphael cartoons, which became a symbol of the achievements of the Renaissance.
He was commissioned to make these enormously expensive tapestries for the lower walls. So you got the Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo, and then lower down, I suppose, to protect the cardinals from the cold, you got these rather luscious tapestries. Raphael did these full-size distemper on paper, so-called cartoons, I mean, fully worked up paintings that weavers could copy.
We know that they're focused on the acts of Peter and Paul, and really he's looking at the drama of the composition here, not so much detail because they'll then be rendered by the tapestry factories in wool. So he wanted a dramatic composition that would really do it justice once they'd gone through to their new vision in tapestry.
Raphael sent the tapestry cartoons or drawings to Brussels, where they were going to be woven, and they stayed in Brussels for some time and were later bought by a collector in Genoa. And then Charles I of England bought the cartoons, and they came to the UK. Many years ago, they were put on long-term loan to the Victoria and Albert Museum.
Just like the Raphael cartoons, many of his works have had to survive extensive travel across the world, passing through various royal and state collections. One of Raphael's paintings of Christ falling on the way to Calvary has even developed its own mythology. Raphael had created the work for a Sicilian monastery called Lo Spasimo, but its journey there was fraught with peril.
Vasari wrote a story about the painting to talk about the way it was taken to Sicily, where it was due to go to a monastery, and there was a shipwreck.
The boat that was going from Rome to Sicily was obviously blown far off course and went up to Genoa.
And the ship was completely destroyed and everything was turned to matchwood, apart from, miraculously, the picture which floated its happy way to Genoa. And the Genoese looked at it and thought, oh, look, that's miraculous, we're going to keep it.
It was said that the waves and the wind respected Raphael's work and wanted to save it.
And then the monks at the monastery got word that it had been found, it had been rescued, and they then petitioned the Pope to return the painting to them.
In the 1660s, the painting was bought by Philip II of Spain, and it went to Madrid. And then when Napoleon invaded Spain in the early 19th century, it was seized and taken by his troops to Paris and later returned. And it ended up in the Prado Museum, where it still is today, one of the most important paintings there.
Christ falling on the way to Calvary is not the only work by Raphael to be seized by invading forces. The Nazis stole his portrait of a young man, which may very well be Raphael himself, and it's potentially the most valuable missing work of art in the world.
The portrait of a young man, or assumed self-portrait of Raphael, was taken by the Nazis from Poland during the Second World War, and most art historians, or many art historians, are in agreement that it's probably the most valuable painting ever to go missing.
In January 1945, when the Allies were pushing forward into Poland, the painting just disappeared.
We can recognise Raphael from his own self-portrait in the School of Athens. Similarities were drawn between the portrait of the young man and his own self-rendering in the School of Athens that point towards it being a self-portrait.
It represents one of the very most important paintings that was lost during the Second World War.
Leonardo's masterpiece, The Lady with an Ermine, was also stolen alongside the Raphael portrait. The Monuments Men would heroically rescue the Leonardo at the end of World War II. Sadly, the Raphael would not share the same luck. Not all of Raphael's works have vanished in quite so dramatic a fashion. His Madonna of the Pinks has only recently been reattributed to him. The painting was highly influenced by Leonardo's own Benoit Madonna, a work that was lost for centuries before making a sensational reappearance. Not only did Raphael take inspiration from Leonardo during his lifetime, it would seem his paintings would also follow a similar journey.
20 or so years ago, Nicholas Penny, who later became director of the National Gallery, was visiting Alnwick Castle, which belongs to the Duke of Northumberland.
Nicholas Penny saw this painting in a corridor up there and thought that that was a very good painting, and he looked at it closely and he saw this pentimenti and was surprised and said, well, you know, if this is a copy, this shouldn't have this.
He saw the painting and got interested in it and asked whether it could be examined.
It wasn't their painting, so they couldn't take any paint samples as such, but they could really look very, very closely and look at the surface. It's a completely beautiful painting. There's a charming piece of transparent veiled fabric that is just sort of lightly over the Madonna's ear, which is just exquisite painting.
There are literally dozens of copies of Raphael's Madonna of the Pinks, which shows the importance of the painting. And it was very difficult to establish which was the original.
The test the National Gallery undertook would establish the painting as an original Raphael. They subsequently purchased the painting for £22 million in 2004. Although Raphael has always been considered a master, it would seem that even his great works could get lost in the shuffle of time.
I think you just have to remember that these are centuries-old paintings that are moved between collections. Records get lost, destroyed, changed, so it's difficult to really match up an exact record of what the artist's inventory was with an exact painting.
They've become victims of their own success, so they get copied. So if you paint something that becomes an iconic picture, then everybody else is going to paint it as well. And not paint like it, they're going to try and paint it. Not necessarily dishonestly, but just as a sort of testimony to its greatness.
So I think a lot of works sat under a cloud of, is it by him, is it not by him, and also found themselves geographically scattered all over the world in different hands, and just over time, some of them shrunk away from the public view.
Raphael's paintings have entranced people all over the world, and we can only be grateful that so many of them have managed to survive the trials and tribulations that they've been put through. And we can only hope that his missing portrait will also return to us one day.